Recently, Joe Heschmeyer of Shameless Popery and Gavin Ortlund of Truth Unites have gotten into a debate about the Canon of Scripture and whether it presents a problem for Protestants that follow Sola Scriptura. And it seems to me that they've talked past each other to some degree, so I'm going to attempt to clarify where the primary objections lie and where the current state of the argument is. But before we start, I'd just like to say that I have respect for both Heschmeyer and Ortlund. They're both very smart, probably more so than me. So I'm not making this video to dunk on either of them or to necessarily even try to rebut them. I'm just trying to further the conversation. And so with that in mind, let's try to formalize where this objection actually lies. So we can start with Joe's video since he's the one making the objection. And I'm going to bring attention to the following clarification he makes at the beginning of the video.
A lot of times because we're framing this about infallibility, people will say, oh, well, you have an infallible. We just have a pretty sure list. And it doesn't matter. It's a 99% certainty versus 100% certainty. That's not it at all. Or at least that's not only it. Whatever percent certain you are that the Gospel of John belongs in the Bible is coming from somewhere other than the Bible. If you are 80% sure, wherever you're getting that 80%, is something like, well, the early Christians believed in it, or the early church used it liturgically, or here are church fathers who quoted and treated it as scripture, or early Christians tell me it was written by John, and so on and so forth. You are doing a lot of work outside the Bible, relying upon scholarship or early church or something, and none of that certainty is coming from Scripture itself.
We can understand this and formalize his primary objection in the following way. So the first premise is that all knowledge that is necessary for salvation will be infallibly provided via divine revelation. The second premise is that there is some knowledge that is necessary for salvation, but not infallibly defined by divine revelation under the Sola Scriptura model, and therefore his conclusion would be the Sola Scriptura model is not true. So this is the argument Joe seems to be primarily making. And under this format, it's straightforward that if the first two premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. So to defend the first premise, Joe references the usage of Sola Scriptura in the historic Protestant confessions, such as Westminster Confession of Faith and the London Baptist Confession. And from his response, it seems like Gavin may affirm this premise, but it's a little hard to tell because he prefers to emphasize other parts of the doctrine. Joe also doesn't go into much depth on this premise in his video outside of highlighting that it is part of the historical Protestant understanding, so I'd be interested to see what both would say about it in the context of a larger discussion. Meanwhile, the second premise seems to have been the primary source of the debate, and it seems to me that Gavin and Joe are in agreement that Scripture does not infallibly provide the canon of Scripture, which means that the Sola Scriptura model does not provide for it either. However, Gavin's objections to Joe's argument appear to be focused on the argument that the canon of Scripture is not necessary for salvation under a Sola Scriptura model.
And the philosophical appeal has to do with an infinite regress, that there are certain ways of requiring infallibility for the discernment of and appropriation of infallibility that now push the can down the road, and you're going to need an infallible knowledge of that. And so what we can observe here is that every system has a cutoff point where you move from infallibility to fallibility. So there is a fallible reception of the infallible. And that can be the eardrums of Moses at the burning bush, which are fallible eardrums. Okay. But he's still hearing God, and that's an infallible voice coming from the burning bush. Or this can be the perception of the number of ex cathedra statements within Roman Catholicism, which is a fallible knowledge that is debated, and yet those are infallible teachings, or the number of infallible councils for various Eastern traditions, which is fallibly discerned.
Gavin expands upon this with a number of other examples, but it is generally his position that it is not necessary to have infallible knowledge about the canon of Scripture. So I will briefly step in and showcase where this argument answers the objection and where there's still area left to address. So it is obviously true, and I'd guess that both Heschmeyer and Ortlund would agree, that we both A, come to believe that God exists via fallible knowledge and reasoning, and B, also have infallible knowledge that God exists through Scripture. And the same thing would be true for the resurrection, right? We come to believe it via fallible knowledge and reasoning, but we also get infallible knowledge through Scripture. So these are things that are ahead of accepting Scripture as infallible in the logic chain. I believe that Scripture is infallible because I believe that God exists and because I believe in the resurrection. But they are also things that are necessary for salvation, which Scripture infallibly provides. Gavin provides other similar examples, such as Moses' fallible ability to hear God speaking to him at the burning bush, which is an interesting objection that I'd like to see developed further. Although I don't know that there is a formulation of Moses' hearing of God there in that situation, that's truth or falsehood was both A, necessary for salvation, and B, not found in Scripture. And so part of why I chose that particular clip of him about an infallible list of ex-cathedral teachings is that this is something that is not infallibly found under the Catholic model, and at first glance does appear to be analogous to the canon of Scripture. However, there's a key difference that I'd like to briefly highlight. I would say that it is relatively clear that one could use ordinary means to determine whether a statement is from the Catholic Church, whether it's an encyclical, section of the Catechism, or whatever. However, under the Catholic model, even fallible teachings from the Church are considered authoritative and ought to be followed. There are a lot of other things, such as the Catholic model of mortal sin involving a conscious choice, the Church's interpretation of Matthew 16:18, and other differences involving a developing magisterium that dovetail with this issue. But the gist is that distinguishing between infallible and merely authoritative teachings that ought to be followed is different from distinguishing between infallible scriptures and other books that ought to be disregarded. Unless Protestants believe that Judith or 4th Enoch or the Gospel of Peter still ought to be followed, then this analogy is incomplete, since it's possible for one of those two situations to be necessary for salvation while the other might not be, right? It's possible that it is necessary to note that we have to disregard 4th Enoch or the Gospel of Peter, and not necessarily necessary for salvation, for us to know which ex-cathedra statements are infallible and which statements from the Church are not infallible. Again, none of this is to necessarily rebut Ortlund's point. However, I do believe that there is some ground that is left to cover in these conversations. Joe also seemed to spend a lot of his video making arguments, assuming premise one to be defended, and making points that I'm not sure Ortlund disagrees with, which I imagine is part of why both parties wound up relatively frustrated about this topic. But it's certainly an interesting topic, and it's one that's very important for Catholic Protestant apologetics, and it's something that I'd like to see them discuss further in the future. So I hope that I haven't completely butchered anybody's arguments in this video. This is my first time making a video like this, so if you find it interesting, feel free to subscribe. And I promise I won't spam you with videos. This isn't my job. I don't have the time to make a bunch of videos on topics that aren't important. If you'd rather not, that's fine too. It's not really important. But what is important is that you all have a great day. God bless.